For the Investing News Network, I'm Brian McGovern, here today at the Lift Expo show in Vancouver with Stephen Murphy from the Prohibition Partners. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So Stephen, you just came off your panel talking about the international markets. Can you first of all describe a little bit of what your role is within the cannabis industry and what you do?
Sure. So I'm co-founder and managing director of a company called Prohibition Partners. Prohibition Partners is an international consultancy focused very much on strategy, data and intelligence. We are based in London and Barcelona, but work within Europe, Oceania, Latin America, Asia, Africa, and kind of help companies understand the opportunities in those spaces and help governments move forward legislation within new regions.
Yeah. So Stephen, if we jump into the European markets, Can you provide sort of a quick overview of what it looks like right now? Obviously, we've known that Canadian firms have focused on the Germany market, but what is sort of the stance right now as it looks?
So Europe is still very complex. It is made up of 35, 36 member states that all have individual regulation, individual goals, individual ruling, and that makes working within Europe as a whole quite challenging, especially for Canadian companies used to dealing with single markets. So what you have in Europe is you have a market that has gone from, in early 2018 there was I think 8 legal markets, whereas at the end there's 18 legal markets at the end of 2018. So you have a rapidly changing medical cannabis market within Europe, but they're all at somewhat of a different pace. So Germany is by far the biggest market in Europe and will be for some time. The reason why is, one, because it was one of the first to legalize for medical cannabis. Two, the program allowed for a much wider array of conditions that medical cannabis can be prescribed for, i.e. pain. And third, they allowed for a much wider distribution network and those who could actually prescribe and supply within a distribution.
Yeah.
So there is markets within Europe that have been there for some time. And the Netherlands is a perfect example, but it has been self-sufficient due to a strong domestic industry.
Okay.
Whereas other countries such as France, UK, Germany, they don't have a domestic industry. They don't have a historical kind of reference or a historical experience within cannabis, so they rely very much on the international community, and that is where Canadians, as being global leaders or current global leaders, especially within medical cannabis and cannabis in general, have been able to go in and exemplify their credentials by investing and setting up their business.
Yeah. You mentioned a big trend that keeps happening in these types of shows about the leadership of the Canadian companies and Canadian role players. When we look at 2019 for yourself and maybe even a bit beyond, what's sort of that relationship looking like between Europe and Canada? Like, what is the role that the Canadian companies are playing, and what is sort of the aspect that they are getting into?
So Canadian companies have benefited from public markets, and that public market has allowed them to, I suppose, be quite aggressive in their market entry. So what you have found is a lot of the Canadian companies have actually gone in and fully integrated themselves with companies either through acquisition or strategic partnership with local players who will have the local market expertise and local market understanding and local market relationships. So you kind of, when a Canadian company that has leadership in one aspect of cannabis, it's usually production, manufacturing and some science element, they also need to work with local partners who have expertise in legislation, regulation, distribution, sales, marketing. So the Canadian companies and that leadership has somewhat of a window to demonstrate this international leadership in emerging markets, in emerging countries.
So now, obviously, the European market got a lot of attention last year because of the UK and its decision to move forward with some sort of cannabis policy
amazing.
that nobody really foresaw. Obviously, a very unique case.
Yeah.
We've talked about the Canadian leadership. Does Europe need that sort of leadership within the continent, as far as like a country that puts forward these policies and sort of actively plays a role in leadership?
Very much so. Very much so. So we have a conference called Cannabis Europa, and what it essentially is a platform to allow leaders across health policy, science and business to come together and discuss the issues affecting cannabis and medical cannabis, and how medical cannabis should be treated within Europe. So medical cannabis, cannabis in general in Europe is medical first.
Yeah.
There is some minor conversation from rec, but when engaging with governments, when engaging with businesses, the immediate demand is patients. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients all across Europe who are in dire need of proper medicine. And for you to, for Canadian companies to come in, the conversation has to be focused on medical. So when we talk to leaders in Europe, they lack the understanding of medicine in relation to cannabis, but understand the pharma industry, understand healthcare, understand policy. So it's taking a level of education. Education is key, and education across the board, not just to politicians, education to doctors, education to patients, education to pharmacists. So you have a 2-year, how long did it take Canada to get up to speed? And it's still learning. It's learning absolutely every day. Whereas what you want to do is you want to take all of the learnings from Canada, from Israel, from Australia, from Germany, and bundle that up for new markets.
Okay. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
I really appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you.
From the Lift Cannabis Expo in Vancouver, I'm Brian McGovern for the Investing News Network.